We're back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. My next guest should need no introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. Daniel Ellsberg, of course, rose to world fame with the release of the Pentagon Papers and their revelations about the U.S. military-industrial complex. He has been a persistent voice as an author, speaker, and advocate ever since then for a more rational relationship, I would put it, between this country and the world. And lately he's been concerned especially about the accelerating or certainly continuing risk of nuclear annihilation. His most recent book, which we discussed some time ago on the program, is entitled The Doomsday Machine, and I strongly encourage you to read it. And he joins us once again now. So first of all, Daniel Ellsberg, welcome back to the Zero Hour.
Glad to be back. Thank you.
Secondly, you expressed concerns in an email and elsewhere about, well, let me start with this, actually. Let me be a little unorthodox, Dan Ellsberg, and start with this. After all these years, I am utterly flabbergasted that we are still living under the threat of nuclear annihilation, and far from that being at the forefront of the public consciousness. I would argue that people are thinking of it less now than they were in the 1970s or 1980s. Does that track with your perception?
No question about it. We had a movement in the early 80s, the Freeze movement in particular, that was calling for both sides, the US and Soviet Union, to stop producing new weapons. So they called for it. And it had enormous public support. And more importantly, people really understood the problem. And there were a lot of teach-ins about it and demonstrations. It hasn't been true for 40 years now. People thought that with the ending of the Cold War some years later, at the end of the decade, the problem had gone away. But the weapons didn't go away at all. And the plans have changed, have not changed significantly. Since that time, and people have noticed, we've reduced our overall arsenal by some 80%. That sounds very impressive, but it makes no change at all in the risk of annihilating nuclear war. Not at all, in particular because the US, ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, remain in their silos, totally vulnerable to an attack, so entirely poised to survive the attack by launching on warning before any attack can arrive, or in the midst of a conflict, to get them off, to hit Russia now, rather than use them rather than lose them. That will have no effect on the overall war. It's been true for many years that striking first will not be better than striking second, or not at all, because either way, nuclear winter will probably result from the smoke from burning cities being wafted by firestorms into the higher above the high stratosphere and above, and going around the Earth quickly within days, reducing most sunlight by about 70%, which will kill all harvests worldwide. So people will starve to death within a year at the most, even after the 60 days stockpile that we have is removed. So you're talking about not extinction, but near extinction. 90%, 98%. They produce, not probably everybody. Some people in Australia and New Zealand eating mollusks and seafood, I'm told by the ecologists, will probably survive, might be millions. Carry on, do it all again, same technology eventually. But 90% killed within a year. And the idea that anyone should possess the machinery poised and ready to have this effect is crazy, insane. Shouldn't happen. We shouldn't have that. Both the US and the Soviet Union, now Russia, do have that capability. And much smaller nuclear powers like India and Pakistan have the ability to put enough smoke in the stratosphere to kill 2 billion people or more. And that will continue. It'll even get larger if we should go back to testing again, which the Republicans have been calling for years. So we've got a situation here which even from the perspective of deterrence theory, the notion that you don't want someone else to have a monopoly of nuclear weapons, you want to have the capability to retaliate on the same kind, has no relation to what we actually have. The requirements for that would be Dr. Herb York, who was first director of Livermore Laboratory making H-bombs, once said, to deter an opponent rational enough to be deterred at all, what does it take? He said 1 to 10, maybe at the most 100 weapons. He had a reason for calculating that. Closer to 1 than 100, he said, which would be 49, would be about what North Korea has. So 8 of the 9 nuclear states go beyond that. But the US and Russia each have about 3,000. So it has no relation to deterring attack. It has really, on the US side, it has always meant backing up our threats of first use, the basis of our NATO alliance, which continues to be the case. Poland still wants to be protected the way now that we have Poland and NATO right on the border of Russia. They want to be protected the same way West Berlin was protected by the threat to blow up, they then thought, the Northern Hemisphere. It really was the world, given the smoke, but they didn't know about that for 20 years. But they were prepared to kill on the order of 1 billion people. And there were then 3 billion. Now there's almost 8 billion. But we threatened the 8 billion with the nuclear winter. So, no, I'm sorry. Our allies should not be protected by the threat to blow the world up, to exaggerate just a little bit. Yes, we did do that in the past. It was incredibly irresponsible and dangerous, and it came close to happening, and more than the public realizes. It was not unthinkable to our military or Soviet military to prepare, actually come close to a number of false alarms, which almost set the thing off. Not only the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1983 was another crisis on the Russian side we didn't even know about. They thought Reagan was getting ready for a surprise attack. And if one Russian colonel, Petrov, had not lied about what he saw on his screens about a US attack coming at him, he wasn't sure that it was a real attack, and it wasn't. His subordinates were. So they were telling him, report, it's an attack. He thought it was probably maybe 50-50. I got that from him directly on email, about 50-50. If he'd said that to his superiors at that time, what he really believed, they would have preempted, and we wouldn't be here. And the world should not have depended on, the prudence of one Russian colonel, who was, by the way, censured for not telling the truth about what he'd actually seen on the screens, that there really was a chance that it was coming. He retired on a diet of potatoes in his garden, pretty much. He was had bad psychological responsibility. That's what the world is hanging on.
And I don't doubt for a minute, Daniel Ellsberg, that his American counterpart would have faced the same fate if he had behaved the same way. Now, Dan, you early in your career were a defense analyst and strategist, and you worked with the Pentagon. But there's a sort of, especially with what we now know, there's a certain kind of logical breakdown that I have yet to understand in their thinking, which is a first strike would create global catastrophe, including catastrophe for us, but so for that matter would a second strike, right? Because even if we're subject, in the highly unlikely event that we were subject to a nuclear attack from Russia or any other country, to retaliate with the full force of our nuclear arsenal would harm us immeasurably more than any other response, wouldn't it? Or am I getting something wrong?
Richard, in my experience of discussing this over the last 50 years, you're the first person to raise that issue. I've thought about it a lot. And I don't usually raise it because we keep the discussion within the framework that everybody has been taught to accept of deterrence requires an assurance that we destroy the other country and so on, which was based on essentially nothing. It was a good selling point for buying a lot of weapons. The point I made earlier, at the most 1 or 10 or 100. But you're raising the point, if I hear you correctly, would it make sense to reply with 1 or 10 or 100, especially on cities? If you are attacked, if deterrence has failed because they had a false alarm, or they had somebody crazier than they've had yet, somebody more like Hitler, say, which we haven't actually seen. He did exist, and we like to think that our opponents are Hitlers because then you don't negotiate, you just build weapons. And that's very profitable. So we want to say this person, everybody's a Hitler. Fortunately, had there been Hitlers in the nuclear era, it would have ended long ago. We wouldn't be here. But the point you're raising is a very unique one. So let's pursue it. Does it make sense to respond if you have the capability to respond? And I believe, like most people, that makes some sense, not to give another side a monopoly of weapons. It wouldn't be good for peace, I don't think. But how many? And what do you do if the deterrence fails, if it actually comes? Well, it could not possibly benefit you by sending those weapons over to add to the nuclear winter, to the nuclear strike that's going to be caused by the other guy's effect anyway. You'll get nuclear winter. You won't lose a whole lot. It's just, if you send it, because nearly everyone's going to die anyway. But the idea of thinking that you have to assure that you will use these is not well-based. Actually, my mentor at RAND, now dead, Albert Wolfsvetter, got a Medal of Freedom, I think it was, from the president's leader. But his axiom was that you had to assure the Soviet Union that they would lose more people than they did in World War II, which we now calculated about 27 million. He said, after all, they lost 27, we used to say 20 million. They lost all this and now they're doing fine. So they would be willing, to do it again, basically, to control the world. That was crazy. There wasn't the slightest basis for that. That there was any human in power in the world who was ready to lose 20 million people or 10 million people or 1 million people in order to advance, in requirement. But that was a good basis for saying we need hundreds and thousands of nuclear weapons. It was, but coming back to your point, go to the other extreme. As York said, York was quoting McGeorge Bundy, who had been the national security assistant to Kennedy and Johnson, in saying that people talk about sending hundreds and thousands of weapons and so forth. We had at one point, I think, 37,000 weapons. Might be around the world. In the world, there was, in the late 60s, 67,000 weapons. And as I just said, York makes a plausible case. 50, should be enough to deter anybody rational enough to be doing thousands. Okay, so he said, but actual leaders who are contemplating this, said McGeorge Bundy, one weapon on one city would be a disaster, physically and politically and every other way, such as really had never occurred, or enormous. He said 10 on 10 cities. He said, unprecedented, fantastic disaster. He said 100 on 100 cities, unthinkable. Well, unthinkable for, wanting to do it. But in terms of planning, our plans under Eisenhower called for hitting every city in Russia and China, regardless of how the war started. Over West Berlin, Chinese not involved at all, but there was, he thought, a Sino-Soviet bloc, which had existed before, but didn't by the time he left office. But in any case, we're not going to leave China surviving a war that mutually destroys the US and Russia. Well, you've raised the point that even second strike, actually carrying it out, the capability to do it is one thing. Actually doing it has no rationality to it at all. But our plans have always been based on an even more insane, well, in reality, insane notion. In past times, it made sense that striking first, however bad it may be in the consequences, is less bad than striking second. Well, that's plausible to everybody. We base our entire system on that, a preparation to preempt, to strike second first. Even if we anticipate an attack, get in the first blow. It makes no difference. In the nuclear age, that's been true for over half a century. In fact, striking first is not less bad than striking second. But thinking that does sell a lot of weapons, and it gives the Air Force and the Navy an important role, so that even the Navy has acquired in its submarines super high accuracy, super fuses that are extremely accurate, as much so as ICBMs. Why? Doing that will not save any lives. It will not do anything except bring about a nuclear winter anyway. But no, let's, the Air Force has it. We should have the accuracy too. The Russians, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, they felt, we had to back down because of what the US had, so forth. So we want what the US had. So Khrushchev goes out and Brezhnev gives them what the US had, a doomsday machine. That was not in their interest, and it came close to bankrupting them, basically.
And of course, we were told.
You have.
I'm sorry, Dan. And of course, we were told at the time that they did have that they had equal or greater. Remember the missile gap arguments of the 1960 presidential election and so on.
Well, Kennedy campaigned on that in 1960, and the Air Force was saying that in 1960 and 61. By 62, the Cuban Missile Crisis, we did know, and we even admitted better than that. They had what we thought in the Pentagon at the time of the crisis, when I was involved at a high staff level, about 10 operational weapons, ICBMs. Others have said as many as 40. We had thousands of warheads within range of Russia. We have bases all over the world. We had airplanes, short-range missiles, and we had Polaris submarines at sea. And we had in 61 alone, we had 40 Atlas and Titan missiles, 10 times more than the 4 that they had. But when, as you said, in 61, when I was at Strategic Air Command headquarters in Offutt, Omaha, the then commander estimated that they then had 1,000 missiles. Well, the next month, our surveillance satellites showed 4, quite a bit. And yet it was after that the Minuteman program of thousands came down to 1,000. The Air Force, LeMay wanted 10,000, the Joint Chief of the Air Force. A little more realistic, they wanted 6,000. McNamara said to Kennedy, if we do less than 1,000 for Congress, they would impeach us. We'd be impeached. Well, that was true in 61 in the belief, as you say, that Hay had 1,000, or hundreds.
Right.
There was an alternative, and that was to tell the public that they had 4.
Right.
Kennedy never did that. McNamara never did that. There's never been candor about the actual situation there. So yes, he wouldn't have been impeached for having only 1,000 Minuteman missiles when the Russians had 4. I don't think so. But that wasn't what they wanted. The industry building these, Boeing at that time and others, good for the economy. We're not buying them from Switzerland. We're buying them from American firms. You can't have too much.
Good for the economy and in the short run. And Dan Ellsberg, we've been talking about the tactics and the psychology and so on, and I would argue the misrepresentation and so on to the public, but multiple factors. But the one thing we haven't talked about before we get to the present day is the possibility of error. It just seems to me to be common sense that if you have 10 launch systems in 10 locations capable of taking out 10 cities, that is the difference between that and, let's say, 1,000 locations. There's a tenfold multiplication, if not more, in the possibility of error that could cause well, you mentioned the Russian colonel who, there are any number of errors that could take place with such a vast array of not just missiles and ICBMs, but systems and so on. Aren't we living with this constant threat of accidental holocausts every day?
Yes.
Okay, well, that was easy. Not a good answer, but an easy one. I can understand
that. Wasn't a good answer? You didn't think that was a good answer?
Well,
Okay.
I mean, not a cheerful answer, but
It was not, no, there's no
perfectly good.
cheerfulness in this story. We're going to continue to keep ICBMs in those silos, the Minuteman and then the new ground-based strategic deterrent, although that means a totally avoidable and unnecessary risk of launch on warning, because those are the only weapons that confront the president with the need to get them off the ground before they're destroyed. The strategic weapons. Planes can be taken off, but they can come back. Missiles can't. Submarine missiles are under no threat of attack. There is no pressure on the president for a fast reaction. Only these ICBMs. Could it be mistaken? Yes, it's often been mistaken. Fortunately, not long enough to actually push the button and get these things going. But could that happen? Absolutely. Could have happened several times in the past, could happen in the future. So there's no excuse for this risk. In other words, we can't eliminate the risk of nuclear weapons anytime soon in the world. We could eliminate the risk of launching on warning ICBMs that have not been, even in the most hawkish terms. And I was a Cold Warrior when I was working on these war plans. But from that point of view, they should have been retired, eliminated, silos filled with concrete. So the Russians, if they get a false alarm that there's 100 missiles on the way, as they have, or as we have, they would say, no, they don't have 100 missiles there. They're gone. That would be better. For instance, if we got an indication China now had 100 missiles coming to the United States, we would know that is wrong because they don't have 100 missiles.
Right.
They never have that. But okay, so we could get rid of that, and we aren't, because there's Northrop Grumman's profits, there's the health of the aerospace industry, and there's the campaign donations that all the people in the Armed Services Committee, essentially, with the chairman getting the most, naturally. Is that why Adam Smith, the chairman, shifted from a position against the new ICBM, which he said was not necessary, was dangerous? He had all the arguments against it, and then shifted in June after 2 years for some reason. Someone told him, Mr. Smith, that won't wash. Northrop Grumman has its contracts already. Lockheed is a subcontractor. There are subcontractors in almost every state, in most of the states in the union. Jobs. This is not the time to, we need those votes for our Build Back Better program and so forth. This is not the time to antagonize people who have bases in their state.
I could be wrong about this, Daniel Ellsberg, but I think there are actually defense contractor jobs of some kind in every congressional district, all 435 in this country.
Of some kind, yes, virtually all, yes.
And let's talk for a second about Northrop Grumman.
I mean, even a single contract, they manage even on one thing, like the ground-based strategic deterrent. They spread it out to things like, I think the F-35, for instance, a total pork barrel system, has contracts in at least 39 states.
There are at least 1,000 F-35 jobs in Vermont, for example, which is a very small state. So let's talk about Northrop.
That is not unrelated to the fact that Bernie Sanders, who I backed, in the primaries for sure, but Bernie Sanders has not opposed the F-35 to bases in Vermont.
Bernie was my boss, and I can't refute your statement. Now
Bernie is what I'm saying.
Yes, well, it's hard to stay in office when you have to explain.
Right.
It's a choice of the kind of conversation we're having now, or the one that says, your cousin just lost her job, right? That's what we're up against. But let's talk about Northrop Grumman for a second, and let's talk about the so-called GBSD, the ground-based strategic deterrent. First of all, this name strikes me that in 65 years or however long it's been, Cold War nomenclature has not evolved at all, right? Because this sounds like the name could have been drafted in 1959, ground-based strategic deterrence. So the idea is that this is a new contract for launch-on-warning missiles. Is that it?
Yes, it is. And you're absolutely right, Richard. You're very well informed on this stuff. The word deterrent is just a branding name, just a marketing name. It has nothing to do with deterring nuclear attack. With 700 submarine missiles, far more than you can justify, on alert at all times. If they can't attack, you don't need an ICBM to deter nuclear attack. So the idea of calling it a deterrent as opposed to a jobs program or a profit program, a pork program, is, it's a better selling point. And it doesn't bring right out the point that you're being essentially bribed to do this. And in fact, as I said, even Bernie Sanders, and I really mean that, even Bernie Sanders. By the way, it's true of most of the other progressives there. If they have it in their state, they can't afford, they lose office if they lose those jobs and so forth. So it's true of most of them. But they're now adding another function to this dog, the F-35, dog in the sense, not that it won't, actually it does have a little problem flying in rain, for example, but it's not stealthy in rain. It's a stealth bomber, except if it's raining. So in good weather, they're adding a nuclear function to it. So, making it capable of carrying a nuclear bomb. And now I just read the other day, Germany is being urged to replace its aging Tornado fleet of 90 fighter bombers with F-35s, which it had rejected earlier. So we're pressing F-35. F-35, and partly because some of the competing things in Europe, Typhoon and so forth, are not configured for US tactical nuclear bombs. So we have to have the F-35 with a nuclear bomb. Now, imagine, this is in Germany, imagine a war in which those F-35s used their nuclear bombs. That's a war in which probably no German would survive, and almost nobody in Europe, West or East. Or anybody. It's the war. So why do we need another set of triggers to nuclear war to get them off before they can be destroyed? And by the way, on F-35 bases, they could be destroyed very quickly by cruise missiles from Russia. They're near, and so forth. They're vulnerable, just like the ICBMs. So all this is insane from one point of view, well, from almost any point of view, except if your job depends on not recognizing this.
So I'm sorry, Dan, but again, my brain is just kind of racing on this one. So we want to put nuclear missiles on F-35s based in Germany or owned by the Germans.
Germany, elsewhere too. We have nuclear weapons in Belgium. I think it's Belgium, Italy, I believe. Anyway, about 5 places, but including Germany. And the Germans have the Diet has asked more than once to get those nuclear weapons out. But the leadership says, no, that would anger the United States. We don't want to do that.
So we have these F-35 nuclear armed F-35s potentially in Germany that are stealth aircraft unless it rains, and which gets to the human dimension of it. We talked about the potential for hard equipment failure, malfunction, a false read, whatever, false positive on an incoming missile or whatever. But then there's the fact that you're now also taking this lethal technology and spreading it among more countries, more hands, more chains of command, more opportunities for misunderstanding or failure or a coup or any number of eventualities, and you're placing them close to Russia, where Russia will see it more as of a threat, so they're more likely to attack, which could trigger the very conflict they're supposed to deter. Am I on the right track here in all this? Because it sounds crazier the more I talk.
Well, that's right. We were on the wrong track. You're on the right track. As George Kennan said, containment, Cold War, that this extending NATO against the promises that had been made by James Baker and others to Gorbachev, that we would not extend NATO an inch to the east if they took their troops out of Germany, which they did, and allowed the unification. We will not extend NATO. It's a question now whether there was a conscious lie at the time or whether they changed their minds, but they didn't, unfortunately, put it in writing. The Russians are always complaining about this. You didn't write it down. We trusted your word and so forth. So right away, as soon as the Berlin Wall came down, that miracle, in effect, in '89, a new book by Andrew Coburn, C-O-C-K.
Sure, I know. We know him.
Spoils of War. You know this?
Right,
movie?
Absolutely, yeah.
He has an excellent chapter showing that the head of Lockheed was in Warsaw. As soon as they, remember, it's still in the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact had not dissolved yet. You could see that it was going, so forth. So they were immediately over in Poland selling, I think it was F-20s or something like that. Some fighter about here's what you need. Here's what you're going to have in the future. The extension to the east of NATO, right up to the borders of the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union, now Russia, including the Baltic states, which had been part of the Soviet Union against their will to some extent. But anyway, now they are on the borders of Russia, to sell them weapons, to bring them up to the standard of NATO, which means to be our weapons, not those crappy old Russian weapons who have been selling them to you now. Real good ones, F-21s and now F-35, stuff like that. And putting, by the way, radar, that is so-called anti-ballistic missile in Poland and Romania, which the Russians regard as extremely provocative, since they could quickly be adapted to offensive missiles, which would hit Moscow in a matter of minutes in decapitation. So Putin has said, certainly reasonably in our terms, we can't reduce our missiles as long as you have these anti-ballistic missiles there. You've got to get them out of there if we're going to reduce further. Well, selling weapons is the name of the game, pretty much. And so if the world goes down, some firms will have profited up till then.
And you don't have to love Putin, especially, to think about how we might feel if Russia was selling nuclear-armed MiG or other aircraft to Venezuela and Mexico or Cuba. Oh, wait, actually, we have a precedent for how we felt about that happening in Cuba. We didn't like it. We didn't like it at all. So, Dan, I promised to get you out of here in a reasonable time frame. But before we go, is there anything people can do other than fret about this to get active?
Look, more than 60, almost 70 arms control groups, anti-nuclear peace groups in general, have gotten together to, say, eliminate ICBMs. That was yesterday. There was a press release on this. And got some stories. Interestingly, and I was one of the organizers of this effort, we've already gotten today, as at the day after, indications from House and Senate staffers that they're very happy with this statement. Does that mean they're going to call off Northrop Grumman profits anytime soon? No, but they do see it as putting on the agenda to explain the direction we should be going instead of the direction we are going, and they are happy about it. Now, they could hear, Senator Markey was one of these from Massachusetts, Ro Khanna in the Progressive Caucus. His staff said, very interested in this statement. So it's gotten more response almost than we could have expected. What people can do is tell their congresspersons, this is good. We want this. We support you in this. We will not. They could even go so far as to suggest to some of the others, we won't support somebody who goes for the ICBMs, but especially the people who are changing the message, changing the dialogue towards sanity. And the others, we could say, we applaud your taking into consideration the survival of our species and its civilization. And this is the right direction to be going. They haven't heard that for anybody for 40 years.
Well, it's long overdue, and I thank you personally for your efforts in this regard, Daniel Ellsberg. And I also, as always, thank you for coming on this program. It was very good speaking with you.
Well, Richard, having heard you, I hope we can speak off the program, but it's clear I can learn a lot from you. I'm very impressed.
Well, I don't know about that, but I look forward to speaking again. Thank you so much. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we'll be right back after this on the 0 Hour.